I'm going to tell you something that still keeps me up at night. Not because it was terrifying, well, it was in a way, but not the kind of terror you feel when a ship's hull cracks at depth. More like the terror of realizing that everything you thought you understood about the universe was slightly, fundamentally, embarrassingly wrong. I've been a cadet for 4 cycles. I've trained under instructors who fought in the Rim conflict. I've done zero-gravity drills in full armor at 3 in the morning, while the station vented recycled air that smelled like burned copper wire. I've done 12-hour marches in low-oxygen simulations. I've done the infamous Chthoni crawl, which my people consider a rite of passage, and which the medical staff here considers borderline criminal. I thought I knew hard. I didn't know hard. The day they introduced the endurance proving was the day I met Cadet Marcus Acaffer. And I want to be honest with you, when I first saw him standing in our formation, I didn't think much of him. He was shorter than the average Chthoni by a full head. His limbs had that strange, soft quality that humans carry. No ridged plating down the spine, no bioluminescent stress markers on the neck. He just looked soft, rounded. Like something that belonged in a habitat dome somewhere, tending to small plants. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand what it felt like to stand next to him on the day everything changed. I want you to understand what it felt like to drop to my knees in the dust while he jogged in place. Jogged in place. Like he was bored. Section 2 Setup. Sigma Reach Station isn't what you'd picture when someone says military academy. Most people imagine something clean. Polished corridors, gleaming parade grounds, the kind of place where the floors reflect your face back at you. Sigma Reach is none of those things. It's a converted mining platform, originally used to extract quantum-dense ore from the asteroid belt near the 4th moon of Pell. When the ore dried up, the Galactic Defense Coalition bought it for a single credit. The story goes that the seller laughed the entire way to the departure dock. They weren't laughing a decade later, when Sigma Reach started producing the best-conditioned soldiers in 4 sectors. The station sits at the intersection of 2 gravitational fields, Pell's pull on one side and the distant drag of the Reach dwarf on the other. Depending on where you train on the station, you're dealing with anywhere from 0.7 standard gravity in the upper decks to 1.3 standard near the base platforms. The training grounds, what the instructors call the yard, sit right in the sweet spot. 1.1 standard gravity. Not enough to be crushing, but enough to make every hour of work feel like 1.5 hours. The air outside, if you could call it air, was recycled and thin and tasted like the inside of a coolant pipe. We trained in full environmental suits for the first 2 cycles. By the 3rd cycle, you did certain drills in partial gear. By the 4th cycle, you did the morning runs with just a light filter mask and whatever your species considered appropriate field wear. The mornings on Sigma Reach are gray. Not dark gray, not dramatic. Just the flat, tired gray of recycled light diffused through the station's exterior panels. The kind of gray that doesn't give you hope and doesn't take it either. It just exists. The wind across the yard came from the ventilation arrays. Not a real wind, just pressurized air moving through grates, but it was cold enough to matter, and it carried the metallic smell of the station's outer skin. That morning, the morning of the endurance proving, it was maybe -4 degrees on the exterior platforms, and the yard was already lit by the flood panels overhead. A pale, buzzing light that made everyone look slightly ill. There were 42 of us in 4th cycle. 12 Chthoni, my people, were built for endurance in dry environments. Long legs, efficient respiratory systems, body fat distributed for sustained energy. We're not the fastest species, but we can keep moving long after others stop. That's our pride. That's the thing we talk about around shared meals, the thing instructors mention when they're trying to make the other cadets feel inferior. 8 Vral. Insectoid exoskeleton, 6 limbs, excellent in low-oxygen environments, not great in heat, prone to seizing up in extreme cold. solid middle-of-the-pack performers in most physical metrics. 6 Donald, the big ones, heavy worlders from Don Prime. Average mass about 2.5 times mine. Slow, powerful, genuinely terrifying in close combat, but they suffer in long endurance drills. Too much mass to move efficiently over distance. 5 Sarathi. Avian descent, hollow bones, extraordinary lung capacity, nearly useless in high gravity because their skeletons weren't designed to bear sustained weight under load. And then the various handful, a pair of quell amphibians, 3 Marin navigators who'd cross-trained into ground roles, 2 beings whose species I'd never encountered before enrollment, and a Thraxi whose name I still can't pronounce correctly 4 cycles later. And 1 human. Marcus Akefer. He transferred in at the start of the 4th cycle from a different station, one of the frontier academies, I think, somewhere out near the Terran expanse. He didn't say much those first weeks. Quiet. Watchful. He ate at whatever table had space and didn't push for conversation but didn't avoid it either. He had a habit of waking up before reveille. I know because my bunk was near the corridor, and I heard him moving at all hours, and coming back smelling like exertion even before official morning drills. I thought he was anxious, overcorrecting. New cadets sometimes do that. I was wrong about that too. The endurance proving was announced the night before. Instructor Thale made the announcement himself, which was unusual. Thale was a veteran of 3 active campaigns, a Donald who'd somehow maintained his physique through 3 decades of service, and the kind of authority figure who didn't need to raise his voice, because his voice already carried the weight of every bad decision he'd watched people make. He stood at the front of the mess hall while we ate and said 4 sentences. Tomorrow morning, 400 hours, the yard, full environmental kit. Then he left. Nobody spoke for about 30 seconds. Then everyone spoke at once. The endurance proving was not a standard test. It wasn't in any of the official curriculum documents we'd been given. It was something the veterans talked about, a tradition at Sigma Reach that went back to the station's first decade of operation. The details varied depending on who told the story. Some cadets said it was a fixed-distance run with increasing weight loads. Some said it was continuous movement until you physically collapsed. One of the Vral in our cycle had an older cousin who'd done it, and the cousin had described it as the closest thing to honest death the Academy offers without the fatality paperwork. The Vral's name was Ket. Ket had a gift for vivid description. I lay in my bunk that night running simulations in my head. I was in good condition, I knew that. My endurance metrics were in the top quartile of our cycle. I'd been training for something like this, even without knowing exactly what form it would take. I felt the specific nervousness of someone who wants to do well and isn't sure if wanting it is enough. Across the corridor, through the thin wall, I could hear Marcus Akefer. He was humming something. A quiet, steady little melody. I didn't recognize it. Later I'd learn it was something called a work song, an old human tradition, apparently. Songs their ancestors sang while doing hard labor to keep rhythm and stay present. At the time, I just thought he was strange. Section 3. Build tension. 400 hours on Sigma Reach means the light panels haven't warmed yet. They operate on a cycle, and at 400 they put out maybe 40% capacity, enough to see by, not enough to feel like day. The yard looked like the inside of an old photograph at that hour, flat and slightly unreal. 42 cadets in a loose formation. Environmental kits on, the suits we wore added about 12 kilograms to our body mass, and they restricted joint movement just enough to make everything slightly harder without making it impossible. That was the design point. The instructors didn't want us suffering, they wanted us working. Instructor Thale stood at the front in his duty uniform. No environmental kit, no excess gear, Just his uniform and an expression that suggested he had better places to be and was not particularly interested in making us feel welcomed. Standing beside him was someone I didn't recognize. A technician, I assumed. She carried a data tablet and wore the plain gray of the Academy support staff. She was already running some kind of atmospheric sensor sweep along the yard perimeter, checking readings I couldn't see. 2 large structures had been erected overnight at the far end of the yard. I hadn't seen them in the dark during our approach, but as the light panels crept up to 50%, I could make them out. 2 parallel tracks, each about 300 meters long, elevated slightly above the ground on a metal framework. The tracks appeared to be on a subtle incline, maybe 4 degrees of grade, which doesn't sound like much until you're running it in full kit with a pack. Along the side of each track at irregular intervals were loading stations, weighted attachment points, magnetic locks. The gravity was wrong at the far end of the yard. I could feel it before I understood it. The soles of my boots registered it, a faint additional pull. The technician had been calibrating it. They'd adjusted the gravitational profile of the yard's far section to 1.4 standard. The murmur that went through our formation when cadets started doing the same math I was doing was low and unhappy. Thale let us sit with that for a moment. Then he spoke. "The endurance proving," he said, "is not designed to measure how fast you can move. It is designed to measure how long you can keep moving after every reasonable part of your body has told you to stop." He walked along the front of our formation, hands clasped behind his back, looking at us with the distant expression of a being who has already seen everything we were about to experience. "You will run the elevated track, 16 laps. At each loading station, additional mass will be added to your kit. You will not remove mass. You will not skip stations. You will not stop. If you stop, you withdraw from the proving. There is no shame in withdrawal. There is also no commendation." He paused. "The top 5 finishers receive priority placement in their specialty track selections for the coming cycle. The remaining finishers receive standard placement. Those who withdraw receive remedial conditioning assignments. Standard military calculus, run or run extra. The choice was presented as a choice, but everyone understood what it actually was. Species accommodations," Thale continued, "have been factored into the loading protocol. The technician has calibrated weighted additions relative to baseline species physiology. You will all begin the proving under equivalent load-to-mass ratios." That was designed to be reassuring. It sort of was. The Donnell in our group relaxed slightly. They'd been looking at the loading stations with the specific expression of beings calculating whether their knees would survive full military weight additions. Marcus Ockhaffer said nothing. He stood in formation exactly 2 positions to my right, and I glanced at him. He was looking at the track, not the loading stations, not Thale, the track itself, following the line of it with his eyes, the way you look at something when you're trying to learn its shape. Then he glanced sideways and caught me looking. He gave me a small nod. That was all, just a nod. I faced forward and told myself the nervousness in my chest was normal. The first 4 laps were almost manageable. The weight additions at the loading stations were automated. You hit the magnetic point, and the additional mass locked onto your frame with a click that you felt in your teeth. First station added 2 kilograms. Second station added 2 more. By the end of the second lap, you were carrying an extra 8 kilograms on top of your basic kit, and the incline at the far end had started to feel real in your calves and thighs. The Chthoni were pacing well. I could see my people spread through the field, not leading but not falling back. We were doing what we do, conserving, running at a rate we could sustain. The Sarathi had gone out fast in the first lap, and 2 of them were already looking unsteady by the second. Their hollow bones didn't carry added weight efficiently, and the Chthoni instructors who'd trained us had always said the Sarathi would burn bright and short. The Vral were struggling in the cold. I could see Ket's exoskeleton. He was one of the only Vral close enough to track, moving with a slightly off rhythm. Not wrong enough to be alarming, but off. The cold was getting into his joints. The Donnell were doing better than I expected. The load calibration had been generous to them. Their absolute weight additions were higher, but the ratios made the proving survivable for their mass. The largest of them, a cadet named Gorath who stood nearly 2 meters tall and moved like architecture, was running with a grim steadiness that I found oddly encouraging. And Marcus Ackefer was just running. I noticed it around the third lap. He wasn't at the front. He wasn't at the back. He was approximately in the middle of the field, moving with a gait that I can only describe as easy. Not slow, not effortless in a showy way, just settled, like someone who'd found the correct rhythm and planned to keep it indefinitely. I'd studied enough cross-species physiology courses to know the textbook description of human running mechanics. Bipedal species with a specific adaptation for persistence hunting, a predatory strategy from their homeworld that involved following prey over enormous distances rather than chasing it in bursts. Humans didn't have claws or venom or natural armor. What they had was the ability to regulate body temperature through sweat, which most warm-blooded species don't do, and an unusual capacity to run for extended periods at moderate pace without accumulating the metabolic debt that stopped other species. The textbook description is accurate. It doesn't really prepare you for seeing it in person. By lap 6, the yard had thinned. 3 Sarathi had withdrawn. One of the Vral, not Ket, someone else, had sat down at a loading station and simply not gotten up. The technician walked over, did a brief assessment and flagged him for medical attention. Not a crisis, just the body making a decision the mind hadn't fully endorsed yet. The weight on my frame was sitting at around 26 extra kilograms. My legs were telling me things, not nice things. They were communicating with some urgency that the arrangement we currently had moving forward, continuously, uphill and down, was not an arrangement they'd agreed to and one they wished to renegotiate at the earliest opportunity. I breathed, I kept my cadence. Around lap 6.5, something made me look at Ackefer again. He was talking, not loudly. I caught it because I happened to pass within range of him at the right moment. We were coming off the incline together, a few meters apart, and I heard a low, rhythmic sound coming from him. He was counting. Not the laps, not the stations, something else. A slow count under his breath, perfectly timed to his footfalls. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was talking to himself, keeping time. His breathing was wrong. I don't mean that in a critical way. I mean it was wrong relative to what I expected. At this point in the proving, under this load, I was breathing at roughly the rate my physiology required. My chest was working. My stress markers would have been visible on my neck if anyone had checked. I was maintaining, but I was working at maintaining. Marcus Ackefer's breathing was not the breathing of someone working hard. It was deep, measured, unhurried. Like someone on a casual transit walk between sections of the station. I looked at his pace sensors. All cadets wore basic biometric displays on the wrist during the proving, accessible to the instructors but also visible to the wearer. I caught a glimpse of his readout when his arm swung past. His heart rate was at 148 beats per minute. For reference, my resting rate is 62, and at lap 6 under that load I was at approximately 190. 148. I ran the next 200 meters thinking about that number. Section 4, Climax. Lap 9 was where things broke. Not dramatically. It wasn't like a story where a single moment cracks everything open. It was more like the fraying of a rope that's been under too much tension for too long. Threads going one at a time, quiet and unremarkable, until there are too few left to hold the weight. One of the Cathoni, Cadet Nora, who'd been in my training subgroup and who was frankly better than me in most physical metrics, sat down on the incline at the beginning of lap 9 and put her hands on her knees. She was breathing with the specific pattern of someone who has borrowed too much from their body's reserves and the debt has come due. She sat there for about 40 seconds. Then she tried to stand. She stood, she took 3 steps. She sat back down. A training support officer walked over, said something. Nora nodded once and stayed seated. She was out. I watched this from about 60 meters behind and felt it like a cold thing in my chest. Nora was strong. Nora had better endurance metrics than mine. If Nora was done, what was I? Stop. I breathed, I ran. I stopped thinking about Nora. But I started thinking about the numbers, and that was almost worse. 42 cadets at the start. By my rough count, somewhere around 22 to 24 still on the track. My legs had moved past the aching stage into a sort of resignation, a deep, functional soreness that was going to be very much present tomorrow and was simply something to work around today. The weight had reached 34 extra kilograms by the end of lap 9. The air at the elevated track's peak smelled like metal and cold, and the specific scent of a field of beings working past their comfort zones, something between synthetic sweat and stress chemistry, a smell that gets into your suit filters and stays there. I heard someone make a sound behind me that wasn't quite a gasp, more like a suppressed groan, the kind you make when you've decided you won't make sounds but one escapes anyway. I didn't look back. Lap 10 was when I first realized something was genuinely wrong with the expected dynamics. By this point, the field had spread enough that you could see individual cadets clearly rather than the pack you'd had in the early laps. You could track who was where, who was pushing, who was surviving, who was about to stop. The Donald, Goreth, and one other were at the front of the main pack, heavy, steady, grinding. They moved like objects with momentum, hard to start, hard to stop. They'd been building slowly and hadn't given anything away. 3 of my fellow Chthoni were still in. I was one of them. Ket the Vral was still running, which surprised everyone who knew his physiology. He was running with one arm slightly raised, an old Vral technique that kept the cold-sensitive joint exposed to slightly warmer airflow from the body's movement. Inefficient in terms of aerodynamics, but the alternative was a seizing joint that would end his day. Adaptation. Real-time problem-solving. I had more respect for Ket in that moment than I'd accumulated across an entire cycle. And then there was Marcus HFY. He was no longer in the middle of the field. I hadn't been tracking him specifically. I'd been focused on my own run, on the cadence, on the breathing, but somewhere in the back quarter of lap 9 or the beginning of lap 10, he drifted forward. Not dramatically. Not in a surge that anyone would write home about. He just kept moving at his pace while the pace of others slowed, and the mathematics of that were playing out. He was third, behind only the 2 Donald. Goreth noticed before I did. I could tell because Goreth's head turned slightly as HFY's pace brought him alongside, and then ahead. There was a moment, maybe 3 seconds, where Goreth and HFY were running parallel, and Goreth looked at this human being, this soft-limbed creature from a gravity well lighter than ours, moving through lap 10 at a pace that had not meaningfully changed since lap 1. Goreth didn't say anything, but I saw his stride falter, just slightly, just the hesitation of a being recalculating something they'd believed to be settled. Instructor Thale was watching from the observation platform at the side of the yard. I caught a glimpse of him during a turn. He was standing very still, which for Thale meant he was paying close attention. The technician beside him was speaking and pointing at something on her data tablet. Thale looked at whatever she was showing him. His expression didn't change. He looked back at the track. Later, much later, after the proving was over and we were all trying to remember how to walk normally, I found out what the technician had been showing him. Marcus HFY's biometrics. Heart rate 152. Respiration, 18 breaths per minute. Core temperature, within 2 degrees of baseline. Lactic acid accumulation in primary muscle groups. Present, but not at the levels typical for a being 10 laps into a loaded endurance trial. The technician, according to later accounts, had said something to Thale along the lines of, "Instructor, either my sensors are malfunctioning or the human isn't physiologically registering this the same way the others are." Thale had apparently said nothing in response. He just kept watching. Lap 12. 17 cadets still running. The weight was now 38 kilograms added above baseline kit. Every loading station click felt like a decision someone else had made on your behalf, a decision you disagreed with but had no standing to contest. My legs were not communicating with me anymore. That sounds worrying. In practice, it's actually the body's second wind engaging. The pain signals have reached saturation, and the system shifts into a different mode, something more automatic, less negotiated. You're not really running so much as continuing to move, and the continuation is governed by something below conscious thought. This is when the mind fills in. Because the body is on autopilot, the mind has nothing to manage and starts doing other things, starts cataloging, starts making observations. I was running behind Marcus Ackefer by maybe 40 meters. I want to be precise about what I was observing because I've told this story a dozen times, and each time I worry I'm making it sound more than it was. I'm not trying to make it mythic. I'm trying to tell you what I actually saw. His form had not meaningfully degraded. Every species in the proving, including mine, and I was in better shape than most of my cycle, showed form degradation by lap 12. The forward lean increases. The arm swing becomes less coordinated. The stride shortens and the heel strike gets harder because the stabilizing muscles are fatigued and you're compensating. It happens to everyone. It's normal. It's expected. Marcus Ackefer's forward lean was the same as lap 2. His arm swing was still low and controlled, the way it had been from the start. His stride length had shortened slightly, maybe 10%, but the cadence had not changed. He was still counting. I couldn't hear the words anymore, but I could see the faint movement of his lips. He looked honestly like someone who was mildly tired. That was the most disturbing part. Not that he was excelling. Not that he was faster or stronger or producing some feat of obvious physical heroism. Just that he looked mildly tired while everyone around him looked like beings in the process of being disassembled. I hit the incline at the end of lap 12. 4 degrees of grade, 38 kilograms of added mass, 11 laps of accumulation in my legs and my lungs and my back. I breathed. I kept moving. I watched Marcus Ackefer take the incline in front of me. He didn't slow down on the incline. Everyone slows on the incline. The physics of it, mass times grade, demand it. Your caloric expenditure spikes, your heart rate jumps, your stride shortens to preserve energy. You trade pace for continuation. He didn't trade pace. His stride shortened, that was real, I wasn't imagining it. But his pace didn't drop. He absorbed the incline into the same rhythm he'd been running and kept going. I heard someone behind me make a sound that was definitely not a suppressed groan. It was something closer to disbelief. A small, involuntary vocalization. The sound you make when you see something that doesn't fit into the frame of your expectations. I think it was Goreth. By lap 13, Goreth had fallen back. Not withdrawn, he was still running, but he'd lost the lead. He was behind Ackefer and pulling away from the rest of the field. Whatever calculation he'd been running internally had produced a result he wasn't satisfied with, and I could see in his posture, even from behind, even under the suit, the thing that happens to beings who are competitive and tired, a kind of grim reconfiguration, accepting a new target because the old one is out of reach. The other Donald had withdrawn on lap 11. The human was alone at the front. And at some point on lap 13, I don't know exactly when, because I was inside my own effort and not watching closely, Marcus Ackafer stopped running. For exactly 11 seconds. I know it was 11 seconds because Cadet counted them later, having had a better sightline on the incident. He stopped, just stopped, at the far end of the track near the final loading station before the turn. He stood there. Then he did something that became the central image of every retelling of that day's proving. He rolled his neck, left to right a slow rotation, then right to left. He swung his arms in slow circles at the shoulder, 4 times on each side. Then he looked up at the gray recycled light of Sigma Reach Station's exterior panels, and this is the part that's hardest to explain. He smiled. Not a performance, not a look-at-me moment, just a small, private smile, the kind you make when you're somewhere you find unexpectedly pleasant. Then he started running again. During those 11 seconds, he had not been resting. He had been stretching. He had stopped mid-race to stretch. And when he started again, his pace was, Cadet confirmed this from his own sensor readout, marginally faster than it had been before. The last 3 laps were a different kind of silence. The 17 remaining cadets, by now perhaps 15, I'd lost count, ran with the particular quiet of beings who have stopped negotiating and started simply existing. That state is intimate and shared. You recognize it in others when you're in it yourself. No one was talking. No one was comparing. We were each separately inside the enormous, simple project of continuing. Marcus Ackafer was ahead. Not by a theatrical margin. Not by the distance that produces speeches and ceremonies. By about 60 meters. Just enough that it was clear, just enough that it was undeniable. He was running the last lap the way he had run the first. The same rhythm. The same measured breath, the same quiet counting under his breath that I could no longer hear but knew was still happening. The weight additions had peaked at 42 kilograms above baseline, every loading station had locked, and the final stations had added small amounts that felt enormous given the accumulation. My legs were somewhere beyond sensation. My back was a sustained, low-pitched argument. My lungs were doing their job but filing complaints. I crossed the finish line in 4th place. I know that. I know the placement intellectually. But the experience of crossing it was less like triumph and more like a conversation ending. The thing you'd been inside for so long simply stopping, and the sudden stillness of it being almost as difficult to process as the motion had been. I dropped to one knee, not dramatically. My legs just made a decision. I looked up. Marcus Ackafer was standing at the finish line. He had crossed it 40 seconds before me. He was standing, not sitting, not crouching, standing with his hands on his hips and his head turned slightly upward, breathing in that same deep, measured way. His suit showed perspiration marks that were genuine. He'd worked, he'd pushed, he'd produced the chemistry of real effort. But he was standing. And then, and I want to be precise about this too, he began to jog in place. Small, easy steps, barely lifting his feet, a jog that was really just a formalized walk. He was cooling down. He was cooling down at the finish line of the endurance, proving the way you cool down after a morning run when you've got 30 minutes before breakfast. I stayed on one knee and stared at him. He noticed me looking. He stopped jogging. He walked over and offered his hand, the human contact gesture, open palm, fingers extended. 4th place, he said. That's solid. The incline at the end is brutal. His voice was slightly rougher than normal. His breathing had elevated from the last push. He was genuinely tired. I could see that now, the glaze around the eyes, the particular looseness that comes with real depletion. But he was standing, and he was thinking about me. 4th is enough for specialty track selection, I said. My voice came out flatter than I intended. Yeah, he nodded. That was the goal. He said it like he'd had a goal. Like the proving had been a problem, he'd approached with an objective rather than an endurance event that was supposed to approach the limits of what was sustainable. I took his hand, he helped me up. Behind us, Goreth came through the finish line and immediately sat down on the ground, which for a Donnell his size is an impressive act of flexibility. He put his head back and stared at the station's exterior panels above him. "Human," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. "Yeah," Akafor said. "You did not slow down." "I slowed down on the inclines, a little." "You stopped and stretched." "That was," Akafor paused. He seemed to be choosing words. "That was something I do when my hip flexors tighten up. If I don't release them, I lose efficiency. It's faster to stop for 10 seconds than to run laps with degraded form." Goreth processed this. "You stopped," he said slowly, "to become faster." "Basically." Goreth looked at me. I looked at Goreth. I didn't have anything to add. Section 5, Resolution. The final count. 11 cadets completed the proving. 31 withdrew. Marcus Akafor placed first. The awards ceremony, if you could call it that, Thale doesn't really do ceremonies, consisted of him reading the top 5 placements in a flat tone and making note of specialty track assignments. He read Akafor's name first and paused afterward for about 2 seconds. That pause was the closest thing to acknowledgement Thale offered. Later, after recovery period, we were all in the medical bay for standard post-proving assessment, lying in our respective recovery pods while the diagnostic systems ran their routines. I heard Instructor Thale's voice from the corridor outside. He was speaking to the technician from that morning. I could only hear fragments. "Complete the biometric analysis tonight. Nothing wrong with the sensors. I know what I saw." Then a pause. Then Thale's voice again, quieter. "Find out everything on record about human endurance physiology. Everything the Coalition Medical Archive has. I want it on my desk by morning." I lay in my recovery pod and stared at the ceiling. Through the wall in the adjacent pod, I could hear Marcus Akafor. He was humming again, that quiet rhythmic work song, easy and unhurried. Like someone who'd had a decent morning. Section 6, Ending Line. We talked about it for weeks. Every cadet who'd been there had a version of the story, their position, their vantage, what they'd seen. The details varied. The essential thing was always the same. The test that exhausted everyone. The human who jogged for fun. But I think about it differently now than I did those first weeks. I was angry, initially, not at him, at myself, at the gap between what I'd believed about my own capability and what the proving revealed. That's a normal reaction and not a flattering one, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't there. Later, though, I came to understand something. Akafor wasn't superhuman. He wasn't performing some feat of will that the rest of us were incapable of matching. He was using something very specific, a relationship with sustained effort that his species had developed over hundreds of thousands of years on a planet where persistence was the only strategy available, where you couldn't outrun your problems, where you couldn't outmuscle or out-armor or outfly them, where the only option always was to keep going. That's not a technique. It's not a training protocol. It's something older than protocols, something built into the way his body talks to itself. I've thought about it so many times, and here is the simplest version I can give you. Every species in that proving was asking itself, at some point, can I continue? Marcus Akafor was asking a different question. He was asking, how long until I need to stop? And the answer kept not coming. End of Part 1. Part 2, the thing they didn't put in the manual. Document classification, personal account, oral history archive continued. Galactic Defense Academy, Sigma Reach Station. Narrator, Cadet 2nd Class Velsoreth, Marin Species, 3rd Cycle, Cross-Drain Ground. Secondary narration, Technician Specialist Dara Finn, Human, Academy Medical Support Division. Filed under Human Integration Studies Vol. 12 Supplementary. Transcribed by Academy Archivist Sul Pav. Section 1 Hook. My name is Vel Soreth, and I am not a ground soldier. I want to establish that immediately because everything I'm about to tell you happened in a context where I had no business being, and part of the reason the whole thing hit me as hard as it did is because I came at it from the outside, not from inside the formation, not from inside the effort. I watched it from the observation rail on the upper platform, with my data tablet and my species accommodation exemption and my complete, embarrassing comfort. I'm a Marin. We're navigators. We train in mathematics and systems modeling and the kind of spatial reasoning that keeps ships from flying into moons. We're not built for ground trials. Our skeletal structure under sustained load is a liability, not an asset. The cross-training requirement exists to make us marginally less useless in a ground emergency scenario. But no one seriously believes a Marin navigator is going to be the tip of any planetary assault spear. I was observing the endurance proving that morning as part of a cross-discipline assessment requirement. I had to file a report on the event from an observational standpoint, tactics, resource management, decision-making under physical duress, academic exercise. I had a warm station jacket and a cup of something hot in a sealed container and a genuinely excellent view from the upper rail. I watched every minute of the proving from up there. And I want to tell you about the moment that I'm going to remember for the rest of my life. The moment that didn't involve Marcus Ackefer at all. Because by that point, everyone was watching Marcus Ackefer, and nobody was watching the thing happening in the medical tent at the side of the yard. What I saw in that medical tent changed the way I think about humans. Not the endurance, not the pacing, not the 11 seconds of mid-race stretching. The thing I saw in the medical tent. That's what this account is about. Section 2 Setup. I should explain the observation rail first. The upper platform on Sigma Reach's yard isn't really a spectator area. It's a maintenance walkway that happens to have an excellent sightline down to the training grounds. The Academy uses it for instructor observation during complex drills, and they permit approved personnel with valid academic requirements to use it during documented events like the proving. There were 4 of us up there that morning. Me, an avionics instructor named Poth who'd come out of professional curiosity, a second-year cadet on medical observer rotation, and standing slightly apart from the rest, looking over the rail at the track below, Technician Specialist Dara Finn. I didn't know who Dara was at first. I assumed she was one of the facility technicians. She wore the support staff gray, and she had a data tablet that she'd been working from when I arrived, running sensor diagnostics on the calibrated gravity zones. She was human. I noticed that after about 10 minutes when she'd finished her diagnostics and leaned on the rail with her arms folded, watching the track. Humans are, I don't mean this unkindly, fairly distinctive in a mixed species environment. The proportions are very specific. The soft surface of the face, the particular way they carry their shoulders. She was watching the cadets with a focused, almost clinical attention. Your medical support, I said eventually, because the cross-discipline assessment required me to interact with diverse personnel, and I was trying to be professional about it. But she didn't look at me. Physiological research, technically, I'm embedded here for the cycle. Studying cross-species physical conditioning outcomes. And this, I gestured at the track, where the proving had been running for about 30 minutes and was starting to sort the field. This is a data event. She said it without particular enthusiasm, the way scientists talk about field work, mildly interested, mostly focused on the numbers it would produce. One of the cadets is also human, I said, observationally, conversationally. I know, she glanced at me briefly. Marcus, we've spoken. He knows I'm logging his biometrics separately. Is that normal, the separate logging? She was quiet for a moment. Down on the track, the cadets were beginning their fourth lap, and even from this height you could see the field beginning to differentiate. The Sarathi clustering together in the lead as their early pace burned through reserves, the Donal grinding in the middle, the Kethoni conserving. "It's part of the research," she said finally. "There's a gap in the literature on how human persistence mechanics perform in calibrated multi-species training environments. We have a lot of data from single-species human endurance trials. We have very little from integrated contexts like this." And she looked at me again, this time for longer. "It's still early," she said, "but so far the data is consistent with the theoretical projections." "Which are?" She was quiet again. Whatever her projections were, she either didn't feel like sharing them or was professionally cautious about stating them before the trial concluded. Below, on the track, Marcus Ackafer ran his fourth lap in the easy, settling rhythm I'd already identified from above as something distinct from the other cadets. I made note of it in my data tablet. The medical tent at the side of the yard is a standard field installation, a pressurized temporary structure that maintains species-specific atmospheric profiles and temperature ranges. During approving, it's staffed continuously because the Academy has learned over decades that the proving produces medical withdrawal cases on a predictable schedule. The first Sarathi withdrew around lap 2 and was walked to the tent immediately. Over the next several laps, the tent received a steady stream, 2 more Sarathi. The Vral I mentioned earlier, Cadet Wren, who sat down and found he couldn't convincingly stand. One of the Kethoni whose knee joint had been carrying a minor stress fracture that the additional loading turned into a significant stress fracture. The tent staff were calm and practiced. This was not a crisis. This was an expected operational tempo. What was not expected was what happened around lap 8. I saw it from the rail. I had a direct sightline to the medical tent's entrance because the observation angle from the upper platform happened to work in that direction. Cadet Nora, the Kethoni who withdrew on the incline at lap 9, had actually gone to the medical tent before that. I'd watched her earlier, in lap 7, demonstrating a particular kind of determination that I found very moving. She'd been running with a visible problem in her left rear stride, a compensatory adjustment that said something is not right here, but also said I am not stopping. The support officers had watched her. The technician beside me had noted something on her tablet. Nora made it to lap 9, which, given what I'd seen from lap 7 onward, was a meaningful achievement. But the moment I'm talking about was inside the tent. About 15 minutes after Nora's withdrawal, I noticed something happening at the tent entrance. One of the early withdrawals, a Vral cadet I didn't know, had been inside the tent for a while, long past the standard assessment period. The tent staff were visible through the open flap, which faced partially toward the observation rail. I could see them doing assessments, see the medical beds occupied, see the general purposeful activity of people managing a caseload. What I saw, and I want to be clear that I was at a distance, and my interpretation may be imprecise, was this. The Vral cadet who'd withdrawn was sitting upright on his medical bed. He was in some distress, not physically. He'd been assessed as uninjured, but the kind of distress that looks like a conversation going badly wrong on the inside of someone's head. Hands gripping the edge of the bed, head slightly down, the specific body language of a being working through something difficult. Sitting beside him, on a stool pulled close to the bed, sitting with that distinctive human forward lean that means I am present in this conversation, was Dara Finn. She hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. I'd been watching the tent entrance and she hadn't gone in. I turned to where she'd been standing on the rail. She wasn't there. She'd slipped away without me noticing and was now inside the tent, sitting with a cadet she had no formal assignment to and having what I could tell, even from this distance, was a careful, unhurried conversation. I watched for a few minutes. The Vral cadet's body language slowly changed, not dramatically, not a sudden improvement. The hands relaxed slightly on the edge of the bed. The head came up a fraction. At one point he made a gesture. I couldn't interpret it from above at that distance, but it looked like an explanation, something he was working out for himself while talking. Dara listened, said something, listened more. The tent staff moved around them without interrupting. After about 12 minutes, Dara stood, said something final, and walked back out of the tent. She came back up to the observation rail. She didn't explain where she'd been. She picked up her data tablet and went back to watching the track. I watched her for a moment. "The Vral cadet," I said, "who withdrew, are you his assigned counselor?" "No," she looked at her tablet. "He just needed someone to talk to." "How did you know?" She thought about this, actually considered the question, which I appreciated. "The way he was sitting," she said. "The way he came off the track. There's a difference between someone who's physically done and someone who's physically done and is dealing with what that means for them. He was dealing. So you went and sat with him. Someone should." She said it simply, not like a moral declaration, just like an observation of something that was obviously true. Someone should. And she was there, and she had the capacity to do it, so she did. Section 3. Build tension. By lap 10, the upper rail observation had taken on a different quality. Poth, the avionics instructor, had initially come with the casual interest of a professional watching a drill outside their specialty. By lap 10, he was gripping the rail. Not dramatically. He'd probably have denied it if you pointed it out. But his hands were wrapped around the railing, and his focus had narrowed to the human cadet moving through the thinning field at the front of the pack. "His sensors are correct?" Poth asked. He directed the question at Dara. "His biometrics," she pulled up the separate feed on her tablet. "Yes, all within expected parameters for a human at this effort level. 152 heartbeats per minute. Approximately." I was informed the expected range for cadets at this stage of the proving would be approaching maximum sustained levels. For most of the species in the trial, yes. And for humans. She paused, and this pause was the one I've been thinking about since. Humans have a broader aerobic range than most species that have been included in multi-species military training, she said. The proving was designed with a physiological ceiling in mind. The ceiling was calibrated based on the most comprehensive endurance data available when the protocol was established, which did not include humans. The human integration into galactic defense academies is relatively recent. Sigma Reach is one of the early full integration sites. The proving protocol is 40 years old. Poth looked at the track. Marcus Acaffer was taking the incline, not slowing. So the test, Poth said slowly, was not designed with human physiology as a boundary condition. No. Meaning the test has a ceiling. And we don't yet know with certainty where the ceiling is relative to human capacity. She was quiet for a moment. The proving was designed to be, and I'm quoting the original documentation here, an exhaustion event calibrated to challenge the apex physical performers of all known enrolled species simultaneously. And the human is not at the ceiling. He is not at the ceiling. Poth looked at his hands on the railing, then back at the track. "How high is his ceiling?" he asked. Dara looked at her tablet. She looked at the track. "That's what I'm trying to find out," she said. "I should tell you something about the atmosphere on that rail by lap 11. The cold had gotten properly cold by that point. Late morning on Sigma Reach is when the thermal recycling cycle drops and the exterior temperature on the upper platforms goes down to something unpleasant. Poth had produced a thermal wrap from somewhere and was wearing it around his shoulders. The second-year medical observer had gone below to assist with tent overflow cases. It was just me and Dara up there. Down on the track, the field was sparse enough that you could name every individual. 15 beings, spread across the track in the kind of formation that forms naturally when everyone's too tired to cluster. Marcus Akefer at the front, the two Donald Gorath and the other, in a grinding second and third. Then a gap. Then a cluster of Chthoni, one of whom was the narrator of the first part of this record, Vrentok, who I didn't know by name at the time, but who I could identify by posture and pace as someone who was genuinely determined to make it to the end. Ket the Vral, arm raised, grinding through. And others spread behind. How does he do it? I asked. I wasn't expecting a sophisticated answer. It was the question on the rail, the question in the air. Dara took a moment. This was clearly a question she'd thought about and had multiple answers to, and she was choosing which layer to address. The simple version is physiology, she said. Humans evolved on a high-gravity planet with significant predation pressure, and the persistence hunting adaptation is well documented. The ability to regulate internal temperature through sweat rather than panting or behavioral cooling means humans can maintain output in conditions where other species have to manage heat load. The high concentration of slow-twitch muscle fiber in human endurance athletes, which Marcus is, based on his assessment profile, means the muscles resist fatigue more efficiently. And human mitochondrial density in trained individuals produces energy more cleanly over long duration. That's the simple version. The simple version. What's the complicated version? She was quiet for a while. Down on the track, Akefer hit the incline and didn't slow. The complicated version is that I don't fully understand it, she said finally. And I'm a human who studies human physiology. There's a point in any long-effort event where the physiological explanation starts to feel insufficient, where you look at someone doing what they're doing and you think, yes, the muscles and the mitochondria and the thermoregulation, I understand those, they're real, they're documented, but what I can't fully quantify is the expectation component. Expectation. Marcus expected to finish. When he woke up this morning, when he put on his kit, when he hit the first loading station, he expected to finish. Not as a hope, as a premise. She tapped her tablet absently. Most beings enter a trial like this with the question of whether they can succeed. That question takes up cognitive load. It produces stress chemistry that compounds physical fatigue. Marcus entered this trial with that question already answered internally, which freed his system to focus entirely on the mechanics of continuing. I thought about this. Where does that come from? History, she said it simply. A very long species history of doing things that shouldn't have been possible and surviving them anyway. Humans have been telling themselves a story for a very long time. The story is, we can, and at some point the story becomes the physiology. Below us, Marcus Akefer took the incline. He stopped. He stretched. He started running faster. Poth made a sound on my left, a quiet, inadvertent sound. He stopped to stretch, Poth said. He does that, Dara said, when his hip flexors tighten. His marathon coach taught him 10 seconds of static stretch is less costly than multiple laps of degraded form. The math works out. His marathon coach. Humans run long distances recreationally. Some humans run very long distances. Marcus runs, or ran, before the academy, about 90 kilometers per week in training. Poth looked at her. For recreation, she said, it's a hobby. Poth looked back at the track. 90 kilometers, he said. Per week. Another long pause. That is more than the monthly distance requirement for active ground personnel in the Coalition's infantry standard. I know, Dara said, it's a hobby. Section 4, Climax. Lap 14. is where it became something that was no longer only about the proving. I want to be careful about this part because I've heard the story told several times since, and sometimes it gets inflated. I'm going to tell you what I actually saw. There were 11 cadets left at the start of lap 14. The weight additions had reached their maximum. The protocol capped out after a certain number of loading stations, and all active stations had been locked. No more weight was being added. What remained was the accumulated mass and the accumulated laps. Gorath had fallen to third. His form was showing genuine degradation, the specific heavy lean of a Donnell in serious fatigue, shoulders rounded, stride truncated. He was not going to withdraw, but he was not going to catch the human. Marcus Ackefer was running the first turn of lap 14. And he was not alone. Cadet Vrenthock, fourth place, 40 meters behind, had been running his own race in his own head, managing his own math. That's what endurance running is. Everyone else falls away and you're left with yourself and the track and the calculation of what you have left to spend. But something happened on the first turn of lap 14. I saw it from above. Vrenthock stumbled. Not fell, stumbled. A boot plant issue probably, some combination of fatigue-degraded proprioception and an uneven section of track surface. He went left, overcorrected right, took 2 awkward recovery steps and stayed upright. But the stumble had cost him, not the fraction of time, which was trivial, but the rhythm. When you're in a deep fatigue running state, rhythm is almost everything. It's the mental structure that holds the body's continuation together. When you break it, when something jolts you out of that contained automatic state, you're suddenly very conscious again, suddenly aware of every part of your body that's hurting. Vrenthock's pace dropped.